Well, we have a large number of questions here. Several people have asked, and this would go to Andrew and Sam. They want to know, how did you get your data? How can we trust your samples, so forth. So tell us about, I know you discussed this in the book pretty adequately, but go ahead and tell us about the sources of your data for your research.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'll go first. So in the book and with some of the data that we share with you today, the Baylor Religion Survey is a national random sample of American adults. And then we also in the book use the General Social Survey, which is a nationally representative sample of American adults as well. And we draw on those two primarily. And then I'll let Sam answer with the other data we bring from.
Right. So we also use the Chapman University Survey of American Fears, Wave 2019. And then my colleague and co-author, a guy named Joshua Grubbs, who's a psychologist at Bowling Green State. We've been collecting panel data called the Public Discourse and Ethics Survey for the past, I guess, about a year now. And we've collected 4 waves of that data and are going to collect more waves in the future. But I want to underscore that's a tremendously important question. How can you trust the data that we're using? I think what gives us, all of them are nationally representative samples, either through the sampling method or through the weights that are applied or like applied to the data. But I would just underscore that the findings that we present with regard to, say, like predicting Trump vote or Americans' behaviors or Americans' attitudes towards racial issues or sexuality or gender or those kinds of things, they're the same in every survey. I mean, I can't underscore enough like how no matter what survey we use, in any survey that we've been able to test these kinds of hypotheses, the results stay the same, and no matter what we control for. So even if we control for, say, religious identity or political identity or Republican Party or age or region, all of these things seem to point to just the profound strength of Christian nationalism as an ideology that seems to influence Americans' behaviors and attitudes.
What is the next question? I'm so sorry. Oh, you talk about LGBT organizing. Look, all political members of all political parties organize, obviously, to turn out the vote and deliver messaging to people who would be favorable to the message. But a big difference is that in the sort of in the Christian nationalist sphere, the messaging, a lot of the sort of the infrastructure sits at the top of a long pyramid that operates largely in the religious sphere, which means it's exempt from taxes and also exempt from public scrutiny. I mean, it's interesting. I think that folks on the religious right like to say we're just like everyone else when they want to say put their programs in public schools and just want to say put in God We Trust signage everywhere. They say, well, this is just a perspective like everyone else. We're just trying to take advantage of the forum, and we just want to have our speech, have our free speech like everyone else, and be treated on the same basis. But they're also not treated. Are they treated, the same way not by our tax code? Religions enjoy substantial benefits and exemptions that other non-religious nonprofits do not enjoy. They're not treated the same by our legal code. Religions are allowed to discriminate against people of other faiths, against women in ways that other non-religious nonprofits are allowed to do. So it seems like it's kind of trying to have things both ways, isn't it? You sort of want to have your cake and eat it too. You want your tax exemptions and exemptions from public scrutiny and a license to discriminate, of course, when you want it, and yet the right sort of to do political organizing along with other sort of organizations that are doing that supposedly on the same basis. The fact is, religions occupy a very special place in our society. They have these privileges, I think rightly, but precisely for that reason, they should be kept separate from the political sphere. That's why we have the separation of church and state. We have, I think, the sort of atmosphere of religious diversity and vibrance in our country precisely because we've had a separation of church and state.
Bill, can I follow up on Catherine's statement?
Sure. Jump in. Any of you jump in.
I think our data might have something to say about just kind of the pro-life issue. I think from my perspective and what we're seeing in the data, I think there's a kind of a pro-life stance and even a pro-life activism that I think really takes a holistic, valuing all of life kind of approach, and is the kind of life affirming people of faith that and it's not about, say, oppression, or it's not about constricting people's freedoms, or at least it's not intended to be that way. And then I think we've also seen that there's kind of a pro-life or what I would call an anti-abortion stance that's really just about traditionalism and social order and things kind of violating a way that we feel like the world ought to work. And I would say that the Christian nationalism that we're observing in the data seems to be more of that latter variety rather than a life-affirming kind of a pro-life stance. The reason I say that is because we actually have been collecting a lot of data on, say, people's attitudes towards gun control, the military, war, and even how we lift restrictions due to COVID. And we actually find Christian nationalists, even though they do tend to be anti-abortion, they also tend to be very, very much pro-gun, strong military, pro-war. And they also tend to be very much of the persuasion that, hey, we ought to lift social distancing restrictions as soon as possible. And if people get sick, they get sick. And it's worth the health risk to older Americans so that we can preserve the economy. And those kinds of things. And so that would suggest to me that oftentimes the anti-abortion stance of the kinds of Christian nationalist Americans that we're observing in the data are not necessarily the holistic pro-life stance. It's more of one inclined to kind of say, hey, this is the social order and we ought to preserve that. And they don't really have a problem with violence or death or anything.
Here's one says, I wonder if panelists could talk a little more about the influence of Christian nationalism on American foreign policy. I'm thinking here not only of Secretary of State Pompeo, but also the U.S. relationship with Israel.
Well, I could.
Well, I will. Go ahead.
Stab and then turn it over. So in our book, we look at this a little bit. I think what's interesting is as we look at how those, whether it's Robert Jeffress, the pastor of First Baptist Dallas, or Secretary Pompeo, or others, when they would talk about the nation state of Israel or moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, and they were saying this is a wonderful move. The U.S. is on Israel's side. We find that, in that sense, many Christian nationalists are pro-Israel, where the nation state. But when we ask them about Jewish Americans, we actually find that they tend to fear Jewish Americans and think that they don't share the same values and morals, and maybe even fear that Jewish Americans want to do them physical harm. And so there's kind of a distinction between the people that are Jewish and the nation state of Israel. And so I think that really influences how they view foreign policy, where they want to make sure that, again, for the U.S. to be on God's side, they believe it has to be on Israel's side. But when it comes to the people, they view it very differently. So that's something that we found in our data, but I'm interested to hear what others have to say.
Saying happy holidays or season's greeting was considered not the right thing to say to some people. But you said, this shows up, what do you say about whose holidays? We don't celebrate Diwali. We don't have stores closed, at least in most neighborhoods, for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Do you have any further comment on that, since you are talking about that?
David Brockman actually quoted from Robert Jeffress's book Twilight's Last Gleaming at the beginning of his talk, and I remember from that book explicitly Robert Jeffress says that the government and secular society, or the government in our society, is under no obligation to give, according to his logic, under no obligation to give equal time to any religion besides Christianity. If a pastor prays at a football game before the beginning, they're under no obligation to let a Satanist or like a Muslim minister pray or do anything like that. And so he very much is of the persuasion that preference can be shown to Christianity, and I think he would absolutely say. As a matter of fact, I think Robert Jeffress actually did that a few years ago. He actually posted on his website something about Scrooge or Grinch or whatever, but he basically was listing businesses that said Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas, and so that people could not go to those businesses or shame them or that kind of thing. And so I think Christian nationalism would very much inclined to want to maintain a monopoly on all kind of sacred traditions and expressions in the United States. And I would just affirm. Sorry to talk so much, but I would just affirm what we talk about in our book. We actually show that one of the leading predictors that you subscribe to Christian nationalism as an ideology is that you believe in a literal rapture. This event where this is a premillennial dispensationalist view that Christians are going to be called up to heaven to meet with Jesus before the tribulation, and so believing a rapture is definitely heavily connected with contemporary expressions of Christian nationalism, like Jeffers we've been talking about.
This is another data question, and they want to ask if Andrew and Sam, if you have data, these data for previous elections of Christian nationalists voting for Romney or McCain or George W. Bush.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, this isn't anything that was in the book or that we published in peer-reviewed outlets, but the General Social Survey has a question where it asks Americans and respondents if they believe that to be a true American, it's very important that you must be Christian. And so this is a measure that we use to identify kind of this idea of Christian nationalism. You have to be a Christian to be American. And when we look at past waves, we find that those that say you must be a Christian, very important to be a Christian to be American, is strongly associated with voting for past Republican candidates. But what's interesting is that it's even a stronger association through the years. And so there is something going on where believing that to be an American, you must be Christian was really pushing people more and more to support the Republican candidates over various years.
Professor Eklund is she's a Baker Institute scholar in our program and a great friend both of the program and of mine. And she asks, what can we do as policymakers and those who are interested in policy to more thoughtfully address the political, religion-motivated response to COVID? And we've said something about that already, but is there anything else that you would like to add?
So I think based on the data that we saw related to coronavirus, I think the fact that people who are more affirming of Christian nationalism tend to be very much trusting of their religious organizations, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it does suggest that religious organizations still have a tremendous amount of power among anybody who is a person of faith, and so I just think it's the most tragic thing in the world that these social media posts where you have pastors who are videotaping themselves basically flagrantly violating recommendations and saying that you've got people like John MacArthur, I think was a recent example. And I think John MacArthur has kind of jumped on the Christian nationalist bandwagon for the last couple of months. I didn't think he had, but he basically, is kind of making a badge of honor out of not wearing masks and not social distancing. And I think that's tremendously unfortunate and counterproductive and potentially life-threatening. And so I think to the extent that we can speak in terms to those religious leaders in a way that does not call them stupid or call them or mock what they believe or try to override their religious beliefs, but try to frame these recommendations in the terms of like loving your neighbor. Like it really is the most loving thing you can do to try to prevent the spread of infection and protect the vulnerable. Those are supposed to be things that Christians value. And so I would hope that kind of, rather than just do this because the government said so or because the media said so or scientists say so, rather tapping into that underlying ethic of loving your neighbor, protecting the vulnerable, serving those who are less fortunate by being responsible, behaving responsibly. I would hope that would be my first goal.
Thank you. I want to deal with a question that is a very good one, and this is we or the people here or other people, is anybody saying that that religion shouldn't have any role in policy? And of course we're not. And Believers in Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, traditional religion, all have something much to contribute to moral wisdom and admirable social ideals and behavior. And as they try to shape public policy, they can't be expected to leave their religious convictions behind when they enter the political arena. But their contribution should come as a result of competition in the free marketplace of ideas, not on the basis of a claim to divine warrant. Beliefs that are dependent solely upon revelation, thought to be divine and peculiar to specific religious communities, are simply not a viable basis for either the domestic or foreign policy of a multicultural democracy and a pluralistic world. Americans can't require other nations to adopt the principle of church separation, but I see no problem in our being willing to acknowledge its great success and demonstrable advantages over other models. So you may want to thank God for it, but you don't have to. Now, with that, it's time to wind up our discussion. And I want to thank Catherine and Andrew and Sam and David for their important contributions to our understanding of this influential aspect of contemporary American policy and religion. I expect you'll want to learn more, and good places to start, of course, are with their writings, the ones we've talked about and others you can learn about on our website and theirs. So stay current, stay safe, wear a mask, drive safely. Good afternoon.